Greetings. In this video, I want to quickly compare Deuteronomy 6:4 in Hebrew, Syriac, and Ge'ez. And I want to do this to show just how similar those texts are in those three Semitic languages. Now, of course, we could also factor in Arabic, but for this exercise, I wanted to stick to languages for which we have ancient renderings of this verse. It's my understanding that our oldest Arabic version of Deuteronomy 6:4 is actually medieval. But whatever the case, jumping right in, we'll begin with the ancient Ge'ez translation of Deuteronomy, and the title is Orit Zadagam, which I guess might be translated law which is second, in other words, the second law, and that of course is what Deuteronomy itself means. It's a compound of the Greek term deuteros, which means second, and nomos, which means law. And now, turning a few pages, this is the 6th chapter, and here is the 4th verse, which reads, Sema Israel, እግዚአብሔር አምላክነ, እግዚአብሔር አሐዱ ውእቱ. Right? And I'll just leave that on the screen for a moment so the viewer can take a look at it, and we're going to analyze it in a moment. And of course, you can pause the video if you want to take more time to look at it. But I just wanted to show the Ge'ez and Syriac texts from physical hard copies. But when we switch to comparing the texts, we'll do so via some graphics that I prepared for this video. But with that, we can now turn to the Syriac text, and the title for Deuteronomy here is Sifra de Tenyan Namosa, the book of the second law. And so from there, we turn to the 6th chapter, which starts here. And here is the 4th verse, which reads, Shema Yisrael, Maria Alahan, Maria Hadhu. And again, I'll keep it on the screen just for a moment so the viewer can examine it before we switch over to comparing these two texts to the Hebrew text of this verse. And of course, like I said earlier, one can pause the video if they need more time to look at the text. And so with that, here is the Hebrew text of Deuteronomy 6:4. Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad, or if some prefer that the Tetragrammaton not be pronounced, we can use the stand-in instead and say Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And now we can put the Syriac text that we just looked at on the screen, and then after that, we can follow that with the Ge'ez text, which we looked at the beginning of this video. And now, as these three lines of text are in three different scripts, it's going to be difficult for some to follow along, so we can transcribe each string of consonants into the corresponding Latin characters so that way one can follow along. However, it's important to note that the texts are moving in opposite directions, right? You see, the Hebrew and Syriac text goes from right to left, while the Ge'ez text goes from left to right. And it's important to keep that in mind as we start comparing the different elements in these lines. And at this point, the text can look quite different, but from here, we can use a sort of color coding to note the corresponding elements, and then we'll be able to see where these lines differ, as well as how much they still have in common. So to begin, at the start of each line, I'll mark the verb in light purple. In each line, there's only one verb. In Hebrew and Aramaic, it's the word shema, while in the Ge'ez text, it's sma. In all three cases, it's the verb to hear in the imperative. And the root is essentially the same, with the equivalent of shin or sin, then mem, and then ayin. And you may notice in my transliteration, my transcription into the Latin script, I put a number 3 to represent the ayin. But moving on, in a darker shade of purple, I'll mark the word for Israel, which is Yisrael in Hebrew and Syriac, and Israel in Ge'ez. And you might notice that the Syriac rendering has a samech, where the Hebrew has a sin, and the Syriac also has a yod, where the Hebrew has an aleph. As for the Ge'ez word for Israel, it begins with the language's equivalent of an aleph instead of its equivalent of a yod. And then we can mark in light blue the word for Lord. In each line, the relevant word for Lord appears twice, right, or the equivalent of Lord, right? Obviously, the Hebrew text has the Tetragrammaton, while the Syriac text has the word Maria, which is like a word for master with the definite article at the end in the form of that terminal aleph. And then the Ge'ez text has the word እግዚአብሔር, which is, I've covered this in previous videos, it's actually a compound and literally means something like Lord of the world, right? And then we come to the word which means our God. And in all three lines, in all three instances, the relevant word is the general word for deity, which we can mark in green, with a first-person plural possessive suffix, which we can mark in orange. And in all three cases, that suffix begins with the language's equivalent of nun. However, the Hebrew suffix is two letters. It's nun, wa, while the Syriac and ge'ez suffixes are simply a single letter, which is just that equivalent of nun, right? And you may notice that one letter in the Hebrew text is marked in a lighter green. I just did that because that's an element not found in the other two lines. You see, the structure of the Hebrew word comes off as plural, though I'm fine with saying that it's nonetheless functioning as singular. But nonetheless, that yod marked in light green would typically be part of a masculine plural suffix, though here it's in a sort of construct state with the possessive suffix. That's why it's just a yod, not a yod mem. But nonetheless, because it's signifying a structure that would be analogous to a plural, that's why I marked it slightly differently, because it's an element that's not found in the other two. But whatever the case, the Hebrew reads Eloheinu, the Syriac reads Allahan, and the ge'ez text has aምላክነ, right? And in all three cases, like I said, it's the respective language's word for deity with the possessive suffix, at the end. And now we can mark in red the word for one. The Hebrew and ge'ez words are spelled exactly the same. It's the equivalent of aleph, chet, dalet, or similar to the Arabic word ahad, which is aleph, ha, dal, right? And so the Hebrew is pronounced ahad, while the ge'ez is pronounced ahadu. And meanwhile, the Syriac word for one lacks the equivalent of an aleph, and it's just two letters, and it's pronounced had. And finally, we come to an element which is found in the Syriac and ge'ez text, but is absent from the Hebrew text. So marked in brown, each one ends with the third person singular pronoun. So while the Hebrew text simply ends with one, ahad, the Syriac text ends with hadhu, and the ge'ez text ends with ahadu ve'ittu. Both of those phrases mean he is one, right? It's explicitly using a masculine singular pronoun, right? A third person masculine singular pronoun. And interestingly, that parallels what's also found in the Septuagint. Now, personally, I find this interesting because, as was covered in my 2019 video on Deuteronomy 6:4 in the Sūlam, without an explicit pronoun in the Hebrew text, some, and not only Christians, some rabbinic Jews even, have treated the three references, whether it's Yahweh, Eloheinu, Yahweh, or if you don't want to pronounce the Tetragrammaton, Adonai, Eloheinu, Adonai, those three references have been treated by some in the verse as distinct, as if referring to distinct entities. And thus, the people who took that approach, they took the ending as declaring that they are one, that those three are one. Now, perhaps that's a bit awkward with the Syriac and ge'ez text having an explicit singular pronoun, an explicitly singular pronoun. I'm not sure what to make of that. Of course, those who don't know, I myself am Trinitarian, so I still think there's a Trinitarian reading here, and I definitely think the Syriac text and the ge'ez text were translated by Trinitarians, or at least that's the assumption I have. But whatever the case, with that, I'll close this short video here. I hope you found this interesting. As always, I welcome any comments, questions, or criticisms. So feel free to share your thoughts, whether positive or negative. And God bless.